Well, if you would please open your Bibles up to Genesis chapter 21. We have not finished this chapter yet. I am not fearful, Jesse, for this to go out now, so I've got my Bible open and I'm going to tell a story, okay? And it is on me. But it does affect a person that could be listening to this. That person will probably appreciate what I'm about to say. When you take a look at Genesis chapter 21, starting in verse 22, it is most obvious to me that God wants to deal with Abraham and take any little messes that he has left behind and sweep them up and clean them up before chapter 22 takes place. Because in Genesis chapter 22, we read, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And then verse 2, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." Abraham could not have done that with any garbage left behind. Now, having said that, we may not get any further than finishing chapter 21, but I'd like to tell you something that happened to me. And I did not know it was going to happen, didn't know it was happening. When I had taken care of something that should have been taken care of a long time ago, then all of a sudden I realized why I needed to do that, because I was facing something very serious. So here comes the story, then we'll look at Genesis chapter 21. Some years back, Dad called me and asked me to make peace. And you guys know that my dad was a drinker. He was a serious drinker. He had used everybody else up, and I was the only blood relative that would ever go around him. I was happy I did. I took our daughters. They loved Papaw Charlie. Papaw Charlie loved them. But then all of a sudden, when he calls and asks to make peace, I was hoping he was going to make peace with the Lord. Well, that's not what he meant. He wanted to tell me what I should do with his remains when he died, and that he was no longer going to seek aggressive treatment for his colon cancer. He was just going to be done with it all. During that next year, after we had this conversation, and for the first and only time, he let me talk to him about the Lord. The only time he ever let me do that was the very last conversation we ever had. So let me give this as an advertisement. When you have an open door to share the gospel, treat it as if it's the only opportunity you have to speak to that person, because it well may be. That next year, when I would go by and try to see Dad, I would try to call him, no answer. I'd knock on the door, he wasn't there. He was normally in the hospital because somebody had called the ER, the ambulance, and he was in the ER only to get out and stay home. But I couldn't find him. I wasn't catching up to him. Dad was still a proud man. In his 2 years before he died, he challenged me to go out in the front yard and box him. And I had to say, Dad, I'm a young man, you're an old man, you're drunk, I'll slay you. So let's just sit down and talk. And that's what we did, and he understood that. But the next contact I have with Dad is the hospital now calling me and telling me he passed away, and that we were to go to the hospital and identify his remains. And he had asked me to donate his body to Right State. Now, okay, let's just talk about this, but that's all well and fine. That's free, okay? And I'm going to be down here for a while, okay? Most of the time when you donate somebody's remains, there's no cost to that. Dad had drank up everything he had, and he didn't have money. He didn't have a life insurance policy. But when he passed away, he had not seen a doctor in the last 30 days, and in Montgomery County, they had to do an autopsy. Well, when that took place, it negated us donating his body. It nixed it. So now I'm looking at myself because I don't have anybody else to look at, and I say, what do I do? So I called our dear member, who owns a funeral home, and I asked him, what should we do? And he shared with me some options. Dad was a vet, so we didn't have to pay for a plot. We didn't have to pay for much. And yet, for that funeral home services, I now owed. Now I'm going to really let you down into my heart, okay? Because this is what I said to myself when I found out that we had to pay. Because Dad skipped out on us. Mom had to take him back to court frequently to try to get some child support. It never worked. And there was something down in me that said, you messed me over once, but if you mess me over twice, and I begrudged this very seriously, that dear friend and church member took care of the remains. We went to the VA center. We had a nice burial. I said what I could say about my dad. We had a few relatives around. But now I owed the funeral home money. And there was no source to get it except to open my wallet and get it out. Now what I did is I contacted Larry, one of the twins, but not Gary. Gary's a missionary. I didn't think there was any way possible that Gary could make any kind of contribution to the cost. Larry went to the Moose, he went to the lodges, and they passed the hat and got his portion together. And I said, okay, maybe that's why I don't belong to the Moose. Sue, my sister, pulled her checkbook out and wrote a check for her portion. And I took those and I gave them to the funeral home. But I still had to come up with mine, and I didn't want to do it. And I held on to that for almost a year. I would do funerals there. I would see the staff. Not one person reminded me that I had a debt there. But down inside, I was having to deal with this. Finally, three things happened really. I was planning to go to Romania for the first time on a mission trip, preaching, giving away Bibles. And I said to myself, how is it that I can go there and do that when I can't take care of this? Okay? So it was working on me. At the same time, folks, the church that I was serving had a birthday party. And they gave me a bag of gold, and to the very dollar, it was exactly what I owed the funeral home. And that, when we had the last piece of cake at that birthday party, I told Lynn, I'll be home in a little while. And I took that money, and I gave that to the family. I went to their home and gave that money to them and said, here, it's off my chest. Now, maybe your stories are not like mine, but when we take a look here at Abraham, there is an issue or two here that needs to be cleared up before chapter 22 takes place. Now, let me tell you, once I paid that, it was as if I was on a hoverboard, that I was, not walking on the ground. I was so much lighter. It was done. It was taken care of. Now, a week or two later, I'm in Romania. And there is a great possibility that the young man and I were going to be arrested. We had to go to the police. We had to answer questions. And they could have kept us. And now I thought, Lord, what am I going to, how can I even tell Lynn where I am? But there was a big chance that Christian and I were going to be arrested. We went to the police department. Matter of fact, we stayed up all night long. And I know I've never told Lynn this, but that night there were other people after us because of our preaching and giving away Bibles. And we slept in our car with ball bats in our hands for fear that something would happen. The next morning, we had an appointment with the police station. We went down, Christian was actually more at risk than I, because Christian had left the country without a proper visa to go to Moody Bible Institute to learn to become a pastor. So he could have been kept. So we're not eating, we're fasting, we're praying. And I kept on saying to Christian, it's going to be okay. God's in control. Okay, Pastor Steve, but you didn't leave your country illegally. I did. And now I'm back in it. So we go to the police department, and the police say there's been complaints lodged about you two because you're preaching and disturbing, the people and giving away Bibles. And I said, how are we disturbing the people? The country's no longer communist. You can't do this. It's free. We know that. And so the police officer said, when do you plan on leaving? And Christian and I said, in 2 days. The police officer said, fine, you can go now. We walked out to the car, and Christian looked at me and said, what was that all about? I said, I know what it's all about. And I shared with him this story. But before we left the police department, I got in the back seat, got a Bible, and walked up to the police officer. I said, here, this is what's causing so much trouble. Would you like to have one, and would you like to read it? And he thanked me in English, shook my hand, took the Bible, and I got back in the car, and I said, Christian, 50% of this had to do with that man and getting a Bible, because no one else is crazy enough to give him a Bible but you know who. Now, I believe that Abraham is in a spot here, and he does not know what's about to take place. But he has, can I say, a little bit of a mess behind him? And God is going to help him clean that up before God asked Abraham to do something that he has never, ever asked another human being to do, and never given human beings permission to do it. So let's first look at Genesis chapter 21, starting in verse 22. This may seem so mundane to you, but you remember this. Remember what I've said about the angels. If you're expecting trumpets and angels cheering and you don't hear them, look a little bit deeper, okay? So there's something here to be found, and I believe it has to do with you and I being free from any garbage in our background, that now God can use us. So here it comes. Starting in verse 22 of Genesis 21, we read this. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Philchol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham. Now, if you want to help me put the background together, just think with me. Remember that Abraham had lied to Abimelech and said that Sarah was his sister, okay, to protect himself. And Abimelech took her into his harem, not touching her, but bringing her in, thinking that he had added to his collection, when God himself speaks to Abimelech and says, you are a dead man. You've got somebody else's wife in your palace. And Abimelech says, I didn't know. I know. This is not my fault. And God says, I know. Now, get her back where she belongs. Okay? And I'm paraphrasing. So, Abraham has already dealt crookedly with Abimelech. And over here in chapter 20, verse 14, Abimelech gives all sorts of things to Abraham to say, okay, no harm done, but here, please take this and let's not talk about it, and it's off the shelf now, and let's leave it alone. Wait a minute, though. Somewhere in the background in this story is Abraham's word. Okay? Not the spoken word, but the handshake word. In other words, his honor now has been dented because he did something undermined. And so let's take a look at this. It came to pass that Abimelech and his